Trevor was not essentially a faithful man, or let's say a man who took the term fidelity in marriage tremendously seriously. I'm not suggesting that he was an amoral man by any means. He was schooled in the old tradition. Nevertheless, ladies made themselves available to him. He was a very attractive male, and they saw in him maybe that sporting side of him. They saw in him something that they wanted for themselves, and they would make themselves available to him in hotel foyers or on film sets. And many of these actresses with whom he worked were young and exotic and foreign, and making a name for themselves in films in their own countries. And Trevor seemed to have a weakness for them. One of the things Helen said to me, and it's rather a sad comment in a way, she said there was, after she first married him, that she knew that he was carrying on quite soon after their marriage with actresses with whom he worked. Not just actresses, sometimes people connected with the film who may not necessarily have been on camera. And she said to me once, I'd look at the list, the cast list of his new film, and I'd wonder which of the ladies on the list would be his next conquest. Yes, she was jealous, and she was very, very hurt by that. But it was something that she learned to come to terms with. And she loved him deeply. And I suppose the way she worked it out, and one could argue the morals of the rights for a long time, but I think her reasoning was that it was better being Mrs. Trevor Howard and putting up with these short, sharp, if you like, affairs than not be Mrs. Trevor Howard. It's very true that when filming ended and it was Trevor's turn to go home, he went home back to Helen with tremendous enthusiasm, and it was almost as if he could believe that there was nothing wrong in what he'd done. And I think she was ready to forgive him, really, because she knew that home was where his heart was. And she did sometimes, and maybe this is the kind of blindness that affects you when you're in love with your husband as much as she was, but she was quite willing to blame the ladies in question, more ready to blame them than she was to blame him. And I think that is a very revealing, if you like, comment on her marriage and on the way she felt about him. But they had a wonderful life together. They were married for 43 years. And there's no question at all that he was devoted to her. He was devoted to her in a way that is really quite unusual, even in marriages of people outside of the treacherous film industry. And she tells me some wonderful, wonderful funny, sad stories about him. She told me this wonderful story towards the end of his life, for instance. Well, there's one story where she'd gone away for the day, and Trevor, to help himself, gone off to the gate of one of his local pub, walked there, of course, tanked a few, and then staggered home. When he arrived at his front door, he sort of grappled in his pocket for the key, and he had about 3 or 4 stabs at getting it into the key. As when you're drunk, getting a key into a keyhole is quite a testing exercise. Anyway, Trevor stabbed away at his keyhole with his key, may not even be the right key. In the end, frustrated because he couldn't get into his house, he threw the keys down on the floor, down on the ground outside, and staggered back to the gate to while away another few hours, where Helen would obviously come along later and pick him up. But he never made it back to the gate. He fell. He stumbled over a flagstone or something, bit of pavement that was probably not flat and right down, and he fell and hurt himself. An ambulance was called, and Trevor was carted off to the local hospital. So when Helen got back, no sign of Trevor. The door hadn't been opened, and then she saw the keys. She thought, I'll ring the infirmary. And she rang Barnet General, which is where he normally was taken back for repairs after he'd had some altercation with a lamppost or a bit of flat paving stone. And there he was, being stitched up, and she collected him, of course. It was just one of those incidents. Another one she told me, which I must share with you, and that was later on when he was really sort of quite ailing. He couldn't stop drinking. This was part of his problem. It had become part of his way of life. In fact, probably had he stopped dramatically drinking, it would have probably curtailed his life sooner than if he carried on. And there was one time he was upstairs, he'd had a few, and he fell over again, and he banged his head, was concussed, hit his head on the dressing table, and sort of stretched out. Helen heard the noise, went upstairs, phoned for the ambulance. These poor, long-serving, hard-working ambulancemen who used to come to his house at Arkley duly turned up. Trevor hadn't recovered. He was sort of still stretched out on the floor, but coming round. Anyway, they couldn't walk him down the stairs. He hadn't recovered sufficiently for that. So they had to stretcher him down. So they went upstairs, put him on the stretcher, and strapped him in. He was sort of still very groggy. And as they started to come down the stairs, he said, Henny. That's what he called his wife, Henny. Henny. She said, yes, darling? Henny, what is it, darling? I want a gin and tonic, he said, in a rather sort of plaintive little boy voice. The ambulance man nearly dropped him on the spot with laughter. They thought it was so funny. This guy who was already paralytic had damaged himself badly. The first thing he could think of when he regained consciousness was another gin and tonic.